webinar series organized by the Green Jobs Assessment Institutions Network, also called GAIN. My name is Adrià Rius, and I'm part of the GAIN team and the Green Jobs program here at the International Labour Organization. And I'm delighted today to facilitate this session. Now, before we start, let me just go over a few items that you know how to attend and participate. So first of all, just to remind you that you can also join the webinar using your phone. For this, you need to dial in information which will be in the chat. And secondly, you may send your questions, and please do, at any time during this session. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, in order to use the chat, you will see that on the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box. So please click that. And then on the right-hand side, you will see that the chat box is opened. If you have any technical issues, please ask privately to Delta ITC ILO, who is the host and responsible for the technical and logistical aspects of the website. Now, finally, the webinar is recorded and we will upload the recording soon after we finish so that you will be able to access it on our GAIN website. So now, the topic for today's session is on the challenges and derived impacts of greening the transport sector. We believe this is a very important topic given the transport sector's impact on the environment, health and employment, and we also acknowledge the intense policy discussions that have been held with respect to the need of greening this sector. Therefore, it is now crucial to be able to conceptualize these linkages and identify what will be the cost and benefits of green transport policies. One second, please. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So now in this context, today's session will first provide an introduction on the linkages between the transport sector, the employment, and the environment and employment. Within this first section of the webinar, composed by the presentations of Alejandra from ILO and Francesco from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the webinar aims to provide with one of the main takeaways of the session, which is delivering a conceptualization of the main features of sustainable transport. So in other words, what does sustainable transport actually mean? And on the other hand, what are the main linkages with employment, as will be introduced by Alejandra, and particularly with environment? Once these questions are addressed, then we will narrow down the scope of the session and focus on greening private car transport. This will be illustrated by the presentation of Cambridge Econometrics report, which uses the consultancy's complex methodology to model the costs and benefits of the transition toward the sustainable car transport sector. Whilst the ILO's presentation will focus more on the services and commercial aspects of the transport sector, Cambridge Econometrics report looks at the interlinkages between different sectors. So for instance, acknowledging the role of manufacturing in greening the car transport sector, so let's say in manufacturing electric vehicles. So now, before proceeding with the presentation, let me first introduce our speakers for today's session. First of all, we have Alejandra Cruz Ros. Alejandra is Technical Officer at the ILO Sector Department and her area of expertise is in road and rail transport. She has been leading the ILO work on this sector since 2013. And prior to joining the ILO, she worked for 6 years at the Center for Transportation Research at the University of Texas. Alejandra holds a Master of Laws from the University of Texas and a Juris Doctor degree in Law from the Mexican Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo. After Alejandra, Francesco Di Onori will present. Francesco is Chief of the Transport Networks and Logistics Section in the Sustainable Transport Division at UNECE. Francesco leads and oversees the activities of UNECE in inland waterways, rail, intermodal transport, and transport statistics. Previously, Francesco started his career in the rail regulatory body for the UK and subsequently worked for more than 10 years for the international transport consultancy Steer Davis Glyph. Francesco holds a Bachelor in Economics from the London School of Economics and a Master's degree in Economic Regulation and Competition from the City University London. Then, Richard is the chairman of Cambridge Econometrics and has over 25 years' experience in the application of economic analysis and modeling for policy evaluation, policy analysis, and forecasting. He has provided these services to many different governments and private sector clients. He has a first class degree from the University of Cambridge and a master's degree from the University of Massachusetts, both in economics. And then his colleague, John Stenning, is Associate Director at Cambridge Econometrics and leads the work in the area of energy and climate. He has over 12 years' experience on complex economic analysis aimed at offering policy-relevant recommendations. Currently, John is engaged in delivering projects focused on the macroeconomics impact of decarbonization at a national, continental, and global level. John holds a Bachelor in Economics from the University of Bath. And now, without further ado, let's kick off this session and give the floor to Alejandra. So thank you very much, and just be reminded that you can submit your questions at any time during this session. Thank you, and Alejandra, all yours. Let's start.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Green Jobs program for the invitation. So, the Sectoral Policies Department focuses on the analysis and discussion of working conditions in 22 sectors, including transport and maritime. I would like to first start my presentation by discussing overarching trends and opportunities that are impacting the transport services sector, and then finish off linking general labor considerations. Globalization has impacted both the passenger and freight side of transport. On the passenger side, the global tourism and business travel markets have experienced continual growth and deepening diversification, and this trend is expected to continue. This for inland passenger travel and air passenger services. On one side, with increased demand comes the possibility of reskilling and worker shortages, but on the other side, globalization has led to liberalization by relaxing regulatory environments, and this could lead in turn to decent work and safety deficits in the sector. On the freight side, consumption patterns and internationalization have led to the expansion of global supply chains. And this has enabled companies to easily source services abroad. So, on one side of the spectrum, for example, you have road freight, where flexibility within the different frameworks of the employment relationship and subcontracting rules have allowed logistics service providers facilitated contracting of independent truck drivers without investing in fleets. Now, this in turn has led to a lack of fleet modernization and environmental concerns in many countries. On the other side of the spectrum, the shipping industry that carries 90% of world trade internationally has created a level playing field at the global level through the Maritime Labor Convention, with its own inspection and control mechanisms. The shipping industry, I think, provides a great example of advanced international standards and social dialogue. And social dialogue is crucial for the implementation of environmental and green standards. On the demographic side, asymmetries in globalization process can be observed from a migration perspective, as migrants are concentrating in a shrinking pool of destination countries. The transport sector provides job opportunities in destination countries to vulnerable populations, including immigrants. Therefore, demographic characteristics within the transport services workforce are important considerations with regards to greening requirements and implementation for training and skills. Also, other demographic trends such as urbanization and aging will all have an important impact on transport. For example, investment in public transport will play a key and pivotal role in mitigating congestion and pollution. And in this sense, I would like to mention SDG Target 11.2 that calls for the expansion of public transport. So here, coordination with land use planning authorities is key because uncontrolled sprawling and lack of density pose particular challenges to justify public transport investment. Also, public transport jobs that are key green and sustainable jobs may be jeopardized as urban populations might privilege less green friendly modes of transport. Also, evidence shows decreased car ownership among millennials, and this can constitute another recent trend that can positively impact the greening of personal mobility and the promotion and investment in urban public transport and the creation, therefore, of green jobs. So, climate change has fueled a number of international, national, and local actions to mitigate and adapt the sector. At the international level, United Nations agencies such as the ICAO and the IMO, that are in charge of civil aviation and maritime transport, have adopted international commitments with regards to the reduction of emissions and greening of the sectors. Other possible policy measures include working on alternative fuels or banning certain fuels or promoting the use of electric or hybrid vehicles. Now, transport services fleets in developed countries are generally recent and in many cases fitted already with clean vehicle technologies. Nonetheless, significant challenges remain in developing countries to green the sector, as in many cases the older vehicles and tires are imported by low and middle income countries. Now, this older fleet issue is also exacerbated, for example, in road freight transport, by the fact that in a number of countries, most drivers fall outside the scope of an employment relationship. So they're either owner operators or micro and small enterprises. And because of this fragmented nature, access to financing and affordable interest rates for small enterprise owners are of particular importance for the modernization and emissions improvement of transport fleets. In this sense, governmental programs can provide an avenue for drivers to access finance and buy new and more environmentally friendly trucks. So, more sustainable financing options should also be analyzed. Also, I would like to make an emphasis on innovation and affordability, as this can have a direct impact in worker earnings. Whereas in developed countries, it may be possible to invest in a higher cost vehicle that might be hybrid or electric, it is generally not the case in developing countries. And when I say this, I'm especially thinking of taxi auto rickshaws or tuk-tuks and other mobility options that are urban and that will play an increasingly important role to achieve sustainable urban transport in a number of cities. From this point of view, innovative and affordable add-on hybrid systems can represent an important avenue to green the sector. Well, from the technological side, much is happening in the sector. Apps, smart cities, taxi platforms, freight exchange platforms, blockchain, these all belong to the Internet of Things and are increasing the digitalization of the sector. I wish to only focus on two issues. One, the development of computational algorithms, as they will come and help in solving the minimum fleet problem within public transport and taxi. And they also will continue to reduce empty truck runs, idling by improving warehouse management, border wait times, parking management, off-peak hours management for urban freight, etc. And two, on a second instance, I also wish to touch upon automation, but from the shipping perspective, where automation may bring a number of new reskilling opportunities. So, in the shipping industry, the concept of greening is closely tied to the discussion surrounding automation and digitalization of the sector. And as shipping operations become more automated, the effect on jobs will mostly revolve around reskilling. So, future workforce demand may significantly focus on specialized and highly skilled crews in control centers ashore, although crew numbers aboard vessels might be reduced. So, future opportunities and challenges. We have found in a number of cases where sustainable initiatives implemented by the private and public sectors focus on the economic and environmental aspects of sustainability and unfortunately leave out the social component, including decent work. So, green policies will definitely require regulatory action and, in some cases, policy induced modal shifts. But workforce concerns include from a perspective of industry composition, while generally regulation disproportionately hurts micro and small businesses, and in this example, I'm specifically thinking of road transport, for example, that is very fragmented. So, social dialogue can ensure that productivity, training, and environmental gains can be achieved with consultative involvement and dialogue processes. From a perspective of the employment relationship, I think it's important to recognize that the implementation of green policies might translate into decent work deficits. So, for example, in this sense, even in the presence of an employment relationship, I can mention an example of the ILO/IMO guidelines on fair treatment of seafarers in the event of a maritime accident, which actually covers and regulates decent work principles in oil spills and other environmental disasters. But when there is no employment relationship, greening policies should look at sustainable financing mechanisms. So this because they might disproportionately burden, for example, road transport workers and drivers in the context of a very fragmented industry. Also, more inclusive business models, cooperatives, and platform cooperativism can also provide avenues to pool funding for sustainable and green mobility initiatives. And finally, I think that holistic supply and subcontracting chain approaches are needed for freight, as environmental concerns should also be analyzed from a supply chain perspective, including shippers, receivers, and logistics service providers. This could lead into positive synergies to start implementing, for example, eco-driving training for subcontractors. So, on a finishing note, I would like to highly emphasize that greening and sustainability efforts have an important social justice dimension. Sustainable mobility services and environmental justice have a strong impact on the delivery of social inclusion and access to job opportunities. And generally, the politics of mobility and greening in many cases mirror the politics of inequality and discrimination. So, the more important become coherent and holistic responses on transport planning and greening policies, as they have the potential to promote decent work for transport and maritime workers. And with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Now we turn to Francesco, who was part of the Sustainable Transport Division at UNECE. He will present on UNECE's work on the transport sector, the main concepts defining sustainable transport, and the role of this sector within the Sustainable Development Goals. So without further ado, please, Francesco, all yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today and to present UNEC's role and the wider topic of transport for sustainable development. Let me just get to the slide. Here we go. I won't keep you for too long, but I would like to touch on four aspects, and these are the ones that are highlighted on the slide. So sustainable transport and ECE, sustainable transport within the Sustainable Development Goals, the PEP, which is a strange acronym, but I'll come back to that, and of course the main elements of sustainable transport. So just quickly, something about us. UNECE is a regional commission of the UN with member states from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It's a big area. Through the transport activities, we manage 58 legal agreements and conventions, and ECE is considered the center for inland transport conventions. Just to give a couple of examples, you'll see on the column on the left side of the map, there is a stop sign, and this refers to the Convention on Road Signs and Signals, which sets the standards for global road signs and these sorts of similar activities. On the right, you'll see an E symbol. This represents the work that is done at ECE on vehicle regulations. This is interesting as it spans from the manner in which your airbag is built in your car to how your brakes work, how the car's emissions are measured, and how autonomous vehicles can run on the road. We have a very complicated structure. I won't go into this in detail. Basically, our work is channeled through the Inland Transport Committee and through the number of working parties within the Inland Transport Committee that cover all different inland modes of transport as shown on the slide. More information of this is available on our website, so I won't go into too much detail on it. About the transport conventions, what you will see, some key facts, is that 75% of countries are contracting parties to at least one UN Transport Convention. Of course, the flip side of that is that 25% of countries are not contracting parties to any of these conventions, and therefore there is a significant gap in the legislative framework of some countries in terms of having their transport sector work well and be also safe for users. Specifically for the UNECE region, on the bottom left, we see that all UNEC member states have acceded to at least road safety related conventions. So those that focus specifically on the work that we do in road safety. Okay, so when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course there is no transport specific SDG, but we can see from the slide that transport, and specifically the work that we do in transport, works towards achieving, I guess, a number of those SDGs. We have covered activities for 10 of those 17 SDGs through, as I mentioned before, the vehicle regulations and road safety, but also infrastructure work, the work we do on dangerous goods, and border crossing facilitation. So I promised I would mention what this PEP thing is. Well, it stands for the Transport, Health and Environment Pan-European Programme. And it's an intergovernmental policy framework established in 2002. It's tripartite in the sense that it involves the Environment Division and the Sustainable Transport Divisions of ECE, but also works very closely, and a key member of the tripartite arrangement is the World Health Organization, the Regional Office for Europe. We act as the secretariat for this program, and the aim is to achieve transport patterns that are sustainable for human health and the environment in the pan-European region through an integrated policy approach. This is important and relevant to what we're discussing today, as essentially there are 5 key words that the work of the PEP revolves around. So it's an integration of health and environment aspects into transport policies, a significant focus on sustainable mobility, on international cooperation, on aspects specifically on urban transport and urban planning and land use. As I've mentioned, there are 3 sectors, there are 56 member states that participate in this project, and the work itself, if I can click on the next slide, here we go, is channeled through 5 priority goals. So this was agreed by governments, by member states, and it's very much focused on sustainable transport. So goal 1, to contribute to sustainable economic development and health-friendly transport. Goal 2, to manage sustainable mobility and promote more efficient transport systems. Goal 3, to reduce emissions of transport-related greenhouse gases, air pollutants and noise. Goal 4, to promote policies and actions conducive to healthy and safe modes of transport. And the most recent one that has been added, Goal 5, to integrate transport, health and environmental objectives into urban and spatial planning policies. So, if we move on, making transport sustainable is not only about greening it. A well-functioning transport sector is an essential requirement for the economic and social development of all countries, as well as for supporting regional and global cooperation and integration. For it to work effectively, though, transport needs to be sustainable. Well, so it is sustainable transport. Well, it's safe, high quality and accessible to all, economically sound, environmentally viable, and a positive contribution to national and international sustainable development. It includes improved service quality and quality of access to goods and services, decreased inland transport accidents and crime rates, improved air quality, reduced air and noise pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, protection of natural habitat and open space, and increased social equity and economic development. All these areas, all these aspects are commonly grouped together in 5 dimensions or pillars of sustainable transport: access, affordability, environment, safety, and security. And I would like to quickly just go through each of these to show what the main aspects of them are. So on access, obviously accessibility in transport refers to the people's ability to reach goods, services, activities and destinations from a given location using the available transport system. Many factors affect accessibility, including transport needs and abilities of individuals, quality of transport options, connectivity, the various links and modes of transport, land use patterns, and the qualities and costs of alternative solutions. As can be seen from the slide, there are more than 900 million people worldwide that do not have access to an all-season road within 2 kilometers of their residence. Therefore, the main goals under this pillar are to facilitate access to markets, to basic social services, and of course to international trade routes. All these with the aim of addressing the challenges of rural accessibility and insufficient access to public transport in a number of urban areas, to facilitate, well, to addressing the needs of persons with reduced mobility and other vulnerable groups, and addressing the underdevelopment and the underdeveloped transport links and the high burden of broader crossings undermining competitiveness. On affordability, well, what is it? Well, transport costs money, of course, and as transport accessibility is controlled by the costs and also the returns of passenger and freight transport services, as well as by the sustainability of investments associated with upgrading, planning, and construction of new transport infrastructure. So transport affordability refers to the financial ability of people and societies to access adequate transport services without compromising their ability to purchase other basic goods and services, such as food, housing, education, and of course health. Currently, the poor spend a disproportionate amount of their income on mobility, and it's estimated that that's above 20%. Therefore, transport should seek to allow affordable access to employment and education and opportunities, as well as affordable access to basic social services and long-term economically sustainable investments in transport infrastructure. And of course, for this specific area, transport should seek to address the challenges really which are set out in the slide. So capacity to offer affordable public transport in a framework which is diminished recently following the economic crisis by a lack of public funds. A rigorous assessment of feasibility of infrastructure projects is fundamental. And of course, transport expenses represent a high proportion, as we mentioned, of household income. And so seeking a solution for that is of fundamental importance. In terms of the environment, transport can affect, but it also can be affected by the environment in many ways. So between 1992 and 2012, inland transport share of total energy consumption increased by 2.5%, while CO2 emissions increased by 6%. So therefore, countries need to ensure that they're adopting transport solutions that are aimed to be sustainable with respect to the energy that they use, with their emissions, but also with the land use. And importantly, transport infrastructure needs to be resilient to natural disasters. By pursuing these goals, countries will be able to address the challenges which we have identified. So the energy consumption and pollution from emissions, the modal split, which is not in favor of environmentally friendly modes of transport, and of course the impact of climate change, as we mentioned, on transport infrastructure. Moving on to safety, transport-related injuries are a serious social, economic, and development issue. Developing countries and economies in transition bear the majority of this burden. So transport fatalities and injuries are a development issue that disproportionately affects the poor in low and middle income countries. Globally, well over 1 million people are killed annually in road traffic accidents, and I think that figure is now closer to 1.25 million. Furthermore, between 1996 and 2012, the global motorization rate increased by 64%. And in contrast, or well, in addition to this, road fatalities increased by a significantly greater percentage, by 117%. Therefore, to increase the well-being for all, it is important to ensure safe transport for individuals and increase in human and cultural capital safety, as well, of course, safe transport to avoid costs of traffic accidents. Of course, while road is often the big ticket item when we talk about safety, other transport modes have also a key role. And for example, further steps to increase this have been seen in attempts to remove level crossings on railways and improvements in inland waterway movements to reduce injuries and fatalities in those areas. However, as we know, there remain a number of challenges. So the overall improvement of transport safety we've seen has been slow. And there is a serious problem of underreporting of safety-related issues in transport. There is of course a high rate of fatalities and injuries, particularly among vulnerable groups, and an inadequate recognition of the need for a high level of safety in the transport of dangerous goods. So, here we go, security. If you bear with me, this is the last one, so not much more to go. Of course, the notion of transport security encompasses acts ranging from ordinary infliction of damage and everyday delinquency to highly orchestrated acts of terrorism directed towards transport systems, infrastructure, passenger and freight vehicles. To give an idea, there have been 17 major terrorist attacks on inland transport between 2000 and 2015. These have been across the world, as can be seen from the examples that have been shown on the slide. So we are faced with obviously a number of challenges in this area. The high rate of transport-related crime in many parts of the world. Achieving an appropriate balance between collective security and personal freedoms. And of course, strengthening analytical and statistical information on transport-related crime and transport-related security issues to be able to really fully understand what is happening. And only by ensuring secure transport for individuals and improvement in human safety from the security side, as well as securing transport to avoid losses in infrastructure, goods and human capital, can this pillar of transport be considered sustainable. We're working significantly in this area, trying to bring together various entities seeking to understand and develop transport security further, and we do a lot of work in the exchange of best practice in this field through the Transport Security Observatory that we've set up, and also such events as a recent workshop on rail security, organized really to share best practice in this area. So these pillars are clearly a challenge for everyone, and something that various UN entities are all working towards providing a solution to. In particular, from our side, what the UN is doing through UNECE is the promotion of sustainable transport through policy dialogue, capacity building and regulation, supporting governments in developing sustainable mobility strategies supported by a number of specific tools. There are two very strange names there on the screen. So forfeits, which is a tool to predict CO2 emissions going forward according to certain policy options. SafeFits is a similar tool but predicts the evolution of road safety depending again on different policy options selected by governments. We also have, of course, further development of the UN Transport Conventions and other legal instruments. We work to facilitate connectivity through harmonized infrastructure development, and together with a special envoy for road safety, act as a catalyst to improve road safety across the world. We support landlocked countries' access to maritime ports and work on transport statistics methodologies to collect, analyze data to assist development governments to develop their policies. This, of course, is just a snapshot of the things that we do to facilitate the development of sustainable transport. And I guess a look through our website and the work in relation to the 58 conventions and legal instruments shows there are a number of others. To mention one, the CTU code, which has been prepared in conjunction with our colleagues at ILO, but also with IMO, aims at making the handling of containers safer. This may seem like a very small thing, but the proper use of this code is a quick win that can help save lives across the globe with minimal effort. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening to my intervention, and of course I am available for questions now or following the seminar at the email address on the slide. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Francesco. With this, we reach halfway through the session. So now we turn to our colleagues, our GAIN colleagues from Cambridge Econometrics, who will present the report. And with this, the session aims to also provide with an example of a sector-specific green jobs assessment, although the Cambridge Econometrics used the innovative methodology to analyze the economic and employment cost and benefits of this green shift in this sector. So just remind you that the audience that you can submit your questions at any time, so use the chat box on the right-hand side. Thank you, and Richard and John, all yours.
Thanks very much, Adria. So Richard Linney here, and my colleague John Stenning and I are going to be presenting. Just going to bring up the slide. There we go. So what we're presenting here is the results of a report that was recently published, carried out for an NGO called the European Climate Foundation, who, as you can probably tell from the name, exists to kind of promote carbon-friendly or decarbonisation policies in Europe. And the task we were given, as Adria said, was to derive the economic and employment implications of decarbonisation of the private car sector. The outcome turned out to be that in the case of Europe, we think there are benefits to the European economy, hence the tagline, how the transition from oil strengthens the economy. It wouldn't necessarily be the case, but in the case of Europe, we think it is, and John will go on to explain why. The focus is just on Europe, and we don't, in this study, look at, for example, the spillover consequences for other parts of the world of the actions taken in Europe. It's an important question, but it's not something that we dealt with in this study. What was the process that we followed? So we established an expert panel of stakeholders that are listed there on the left of the screen, the kinds of people who are there. The idea being to try and get a broad range of people who had expertise about the technologies, about the implications for electricity generation, because that's obviously electrification is a key way in which the transition we expect to come about. Plus people representing the kind of the affected groups, trade unions for workers and consumer organizations for households. The key thing to understand about the way we went about this is that we had 3 scenarios for the future running out to 2050. The first is a reference case, which says there's no technological change between now and 2050. Obviously, that's technical change is going to happen, but to compare the other scenarios with something, we use that. You know, the current position basically. If cars with the current technologies are still running in 2050, what would be the carbon emissions and other emissions and energy use? Then we compare that with something that represents the current policy initiatives agreed in Europe. That's essentially a target for carbon emissions, average carbon emissions for the car fleet for new car sales. And then something that's more ambitious with regard to those policy targets, and which runs out to 2050, and which assumes that the new car sales, that new technologies, new powertrains, as we call them, the way that the technology that drives the vehicle, are rolled out and take up an increasing share of new car sales into the future. And some countries have a target for eliminating sales of fossil fuel driven technologies in cars during that period. So we had those assumptions, which we agreed with an expert panel about what would be sort of stretching but plausible. And then we undertake modeling to work out the economic implications of that. And just to say a little bit about the modeling, what was involved in that. So there are 2 parts to it, a so-called stock model and the E3ME simulation model. The stock model, what that's about is this. So you can have new car sales increasingly decarbonized with, let's say, battery electric vehicles as the dominant technology. But of course, cars last for quite a while, maybe 10 years, maybe more. And so cars that are sold now remain in the stock for that period. And so if we want to decarbonize or get largely decarbonized by 2050, that means that new car sales have to, of the new technologies have to ramp up earlier than that. And the stock model tells us what the characteristics are of the stock of cars on the road, as opposed to the new car sales, which are obviously the newer technologies. And then that gives us the inputs that we need to conduct the economic impact modeling. E3Me is the name of the model that we use for that. It's a global model distinguishing all the countries of Europe, many other countries, and other countries grouped together in regions. So it covers the whole of the world in sectoral detail. And of course, you need that sectoral detail in order to distinguish the impacts. I mean, a key finding of this is that the overall impact on the economy is not that large in Europe, but that there are big structural changes. In other words, some sectors gain, some sectors lose, and those are the important consequences for jobs and let's say for training. So we get from the stock modelling the anticipated rollout of new powertrains, implications for the infrastructure spending that will be needed, for example, constructing the charging points for electric vehicles, for anticipated reductions in costs of the new powertrains, for and the other items that are listed there. I won't read them all out. And then the consequences are that obviously the sectors that build and supply the equipment and the infrastructure gain. The vehicle supply chain is altered. The fuel supply chain is changed, basically substituting electricity for petrol and diesel, for gasoline and diesel. And then there are consequences on what households do with their money, because they, as we'll see, we think there's a net reduction in the cost of mobility to them in the long run, and therefore an opportunity for them to buy other things. And then finally, the implication for government revenues, which is obviously important, could be an obstacle to change if governments are fearful that they will, their fiscal position will be undermined by a reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And John's going to take you through the results.
Thanks very much. So the economic results that we see are driven by three main factors. The largest of these is the change in consumption on oil. So a transition to more fuel efficient internal combustion engine vehicles and to advanced powertrains, so to battery electric and to fuel cell vehicles, reduces demand for oil in Europe. And Europe imports over 90% of its oil. So a reduction in demand for oil is a reduction in demand for imports, and essentially reduces leakage from the European economy. And that is the overwhelming driver, because if you're shifting from this overwhelmingly imported products to products that either are completely domestically produced or are majority domestically produced, then you are keeping more money in the European economy, and you are circulating more money through the European economy. And this is better for the European economy in GDP and jobs terms. And actually, these savings can be quite sizable. So as you can see from the slide, in 2030, in our central tech scenario, imported oil is reduced by 49 billion euros compared to the reference case. There's then a question of how this money, this reduction in expenditure on oil, how is that redistributed? What else is it spent on? So one thing that's spent on is more expensive vehicles. So the addition of fuel efficient technologies to an internal combustion engine vehicle, this adds to the cost of the production cost of the vehicle, therefore adds to the costs faced by consumers when purchasing vehicles. And this again has a positive impact on the European economy, because these vehicles are largely domestically produced within Europe. Whether it's a traditional internal combustion engine motor vehicle, whether it's a hybrid, whether it's a battery electric, we still anticipate that the majority of the manufacturing work will be done within Europe. There is a question around batteries. We did a sensitivity around batteries and where the battery production takes place, but my view certainly is that, pardon me, when looking at this kind of transition in Europe as a whole, actually the battery manufacturing is very likely, the battery pack and cell manufacture is likely to take place within Europe. There is also the lower cost of mobility. So we see the total cost of ownership of these vehicles reaching parity or below internal combustion engine vehicles some point in the mid-2020s. So I should explain what we mean by total cost of ownership. This is the total cost of not just purchasing the vehicle, but also the insurance costs, the maintenance costs, and the running costs. So the sort of most well-known trade-off between internal combustion engine vehicles and battery electric vehicles is a higher purchase price versus a lower running cost. And this dominates, and so that's that leads to this shift in the total cost of ownerships as the cost of new powertrains comes down over time, and they keep their advantage in terms of lower refueling costs. Actually, the total cost of mobility becomes lower, and that essentially leaves money in the pockets of households in Europe. So they were spending a certain amount on mobility. The overall cost of mobility comes down. They then have money free to spend on other goods and services. So typically consumer goods, consumer services, but this also has supply chain effects throughout the European economy and leads to the circulation of this money through the European economy. I should also point out, so while a lot of this money is spent on domestic goods and services, some of it, of course, comes through imports, and the modelling takes account of that, of the import content of the different sectors. And what does that mean in net terms? So this chart compares GDP outcomes, so gross domestic product, in the tech, and the tech is the blue line, the CPI is the red line, to the reference case. The reference case here would be the 0. And what we see is that in an ambitious tech scenario, GDP is around half a percentage point higher in 2050 than it would be without this transition. There is also some benefit to CPI. So CPI is just reaching the 2021 targets of 95 grams per kilometre of CO2. So this requires a sort of mild deployment of fuel efficient technologies and a small shift in powertrain deployments, but not the large scale change that we see in the tech scenario. So essentially in the tech scenario, substantially more oil is removed from the European economy, and that's what dominates this increased, this beneficial economic outcome. Now that's net impact, but of course we're also interested in the sectoral impact and the structural shifts that this transition brings about, and that's neatly highlighted by the employment effect. So here we have changes in employment in the different sectors over time. So if we start with those sectors where we see decreases in employment, so the sector that is at least initially most adversely affected is the manufactured fuel sector. This is essentially the oil sector. So reduced demand for oil leads to reduced output and reduced employment in this sector. But because the sector doesn't employ many people in Europe, because most of the value is captured outside of Europe, actually in absolute terms, there are not a huge number of jobs that are being lost in this sector. In the motor vehicles industry, we actually see a small increase in employment in the period of 2030. This is reflecting the fact that we're replacing sort of today's internal combustion engine vehicle with a more advanced, more complex version that has fuel-efficient technologies, which therefore requires more labour input. Or we're also replacing it to some extent with plug-in hybrid vehicles, and these plug-in hybrids have dual powertrains. So again, they are more complex, they are more labour intensive than today's internal combustion engine vehicle. However, after 2030, as we see a bigger shift away from internal combustion engine vehicles and towards pure battery electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, which are simpler to manufacture, require less labour input, then this shifts to a negative impact. So fewer jobs in the motor vehicle sector than in the reference case. However, there are also a lot of sectors that benefit across the economy. So that the increase in demand for electricity and hydrogen, so this alternative fuel to replace oil, leads to a substantial increase in employment. We also see the creation of new supply chains, of new value chains related to electric motors and to battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. And that's reflected in the increase in employment in electrical equipment. So essentially what we're seeing here is a decrease in demand and therefore in employment in the sort of traditional motor vehicle sector, but a bigger increase in employment in these new supply chains. So providing electrical components and batteries to these new vehicles, these new powertrains. Finally, we also see a big increase in services here, and this is whole economy services. So this is largely driven by the third effect that I outlined earlier. So the lower cost of mobility, which frees up consumer spending to be spent on other goods and services. This leads to a big increase in demand for example, retailing and hotels and catering in the European economy, which creates jobs. Now, part of the story is the changes in expenditure, but part of the story is also about the relative labour intensity of these sectors. So for every €1,000,000 spent in the European economy, between 4 and 6 jobs are created in the oil and gas extraction and petroleum refining. And this compares to an economy-wide average across Europe of 24 jobs created per €1,000,000 spent. So reallocating spending away from oil and petroleum towards almost anything else in the European economy will create jobs. We can see that moving spending towards construction, so this would be, for example, the construction and installation of rapid charging points or even the lower powered chargers in Europe, would create 27 jobs per €1,000,000 spent. Whereas consumer services and consumer goods and services are around 24 jobs per €1,000,000 value added. So again, this shift in expenditure patterns away from oil and gas and away from petroleum is going to create jobs in the European economy. One question we inevitably get asked when carrying out these studies is about the impact on government revenues. And certainly I think it's fair to say that a lot of national governments view this as a potential barrier to deployment, or certainly are concerned about the shifts in their tax base. And in the tech scenario, we do see a decrease in the total tax take associated with fuel duty revenues. So it's the orange section here, so it decreases by about 25% from €206 billion in the reference case to €151 billion in the tech case. But as you can see neatly in this bar chart, actually it's a relatively small proportion of the overall government revenue. So it's around sort of 2 to 3% in most member states of the total tax take. And actually, I think it's fair to say that between now and 2030, certainly between now and 2050, when this gap is even more pronounced, there will be bigger changes to the tax base than changes in fuel duty revenues. And indeed, we see some positive impact on other parts of the European tax base as a result of this transition. So the increased employment and the increased output that we saw in the earlier slides, this leads to increased tax take in terms of income taxes, for example, or social security taxes, which to some extent mitigates the loss of fuel duty. I think the other thing to point out here is also that this transition isn't happening overnight. We're not talking about next year or even 2020 a 50 billion hole in government finances, but this happening by 2030 and again a bigger decrease by 2050. But over time and therefore being manageable. There is of course a question of alternative taxation, and my feeling is it's very likely that governments will introduce an alternative tax on mobility, if for no other reason than to mitigate the other negative externalities beyond just the sort of emission side. So things like congestion. If you don't, keep taxes on mobility, you risk seeing a very large rebound effect, so essentially higher take up of driving, leading to these other negative externalities. So there will, I think it's fair to say, be increases in mobility taxes to offset this to some extent. From our perspective, I think the most important thing is just that these are targeted in a way which doesn't penalise advanced powertrains and doesn't penalise the low carbon solutions unduly. So, for example, road charging, which applied equally across all different powertrains, would be a viable alternative. We also looked at the impact of different charging technologies. So these charts here show the demand profile over a fixed 24-hour period. These are indicative. This analysis was carried out for 5 different countries in the study. And assessing how the different charging technologies impact upon the sort of peaks in electricity demand and therefore the potential costs or benefits of different charging options. So if we think about, first of all, unmanaged charging, so this is essentially everyone gets home from work at the end of the day and they plug their electric vehicle in and it immediately starts to draw down on the grid. And this is the first chart on the left-hand side. Here we see a big spike in electricity demand around sort of 7, 8 p.m. in the evening. This would require reinforcement of grids. It would require additional capacity to be brought online. So it has the potential to substantially increase costs to electricity consumers. If we then consider an alternative where actually instead of unmanaged charging, we switch to smart charging, this is just a situation where you plug your vehicle in exactly the same way, but the charger itself works out when to, or is told when to draw down the electricity. And this can be done when there are essentially troughs in demand. Certainly in Northern Europe, the way we see this playing out is overnight charging when there is lower demand, but there is an increased availability of, for example, intermittent wind generation. In Southern Europe, it probably plays out a bit differently because in the future, they are likely to have surpluses of electricity during the daytime when there is a lot of solar availability. But nonetheless, this smart charging profile has potential to substantially reduce costs incurred by the grid. So in our analysis, it showed this was as large as 650 euros per EV in 2030 in France. And we're already starting to see some companies bringing in schemes to encourage the deployment of smart charging. I know certainly in the UK, one of the smaller electricity providers, OVO, has teamed up with Nissan to provide tariffs which encourage smart charging and basically offers subsidies on electricity when you commit to doing smart charging if you're EV. Of course, we've talked about the economic benefits, but the economic benefits aren't why you introduce this policy. They're a nice sort of co-benefit from the policy, but the main reason you do it is to combat climate change and to improve air quality. And our analysis has shown that there are substantial improvements in these. So as you can see from the slide, so CO2 emissions are reduced from a current level of 605 megatons in Europe to 70, so almost so an 88% reduction, and even more substantial reductions in NOx and PM10 levels. So substantial improvements in urban air quality. which is a major problem in a number of European cities. So there are, of course, therefore also substantial sort of human health benefits as well. And again, this is just to emphasize that this is the main reason that you pursue these policies. So just finally, to summarize, our analysis has shown that this transition to low carbon mobility, so to fuel efficient internal combustion engines and to advanced powertrains, is technologically feasible. A lot of these technologies exist on the market already. They are coming to market in ever greater numbers. And our analysis has shown that the total cost of ownership of these will be cost competitive in the 2020s. And in fact, overtake and become lower cost options by the late 2020s. Our analysis has shown that there are both economic and environmental or ecological benefits to the transition. So all scenarios show positive economic outcomes, and more ambitious scenarios show greater economic and environmental outcomes, and it shows clearly that actually this represents a win-win opportunity for Europe. However, there are clearly challenges remaining around the transition and managing that transition in terms of ensuring that infrastructure is deployed. So in a European context and for passenger cars, this might be undertaking some deployment of infrastructure by itself, but it is most likely for the public sector going to be about providing conditions under which private sector organisations can provide infrastructure, whether that's rapid charging on highways or lower powered charging through lampposts or in municipal car parks, for example. There is clearly an issue around integration with the grid. So we've demonstrated the benefits of smart charging or even vehicle to grid integration, where the grid can draw down from the electric vehicle batteries, which has even greater benefits. So there is clearly a role there to manage and minimize costs to consumers. And also, we have shown that there is a structural shift here. There is a transition away from the traditional motor vehicle sector, away from those traditional supply chains, and to new manufacturing techniques, to new supply chains. That will have negative impacts in some regions. So thinking about, for example, Stuttgart, where there is already a concentration of traditional motor vehicle manufacturing, we're unlikely to see an overnight shift in these workers, into the electric vehicle supply chain. So there is a need to mitigate the impact of some of these job losses and to ensure that retraining and reskilling programs are put in place to facilitate the transition and to minimize the negative impacts on these areas. More information on all of this work can be found on our website, so please do engage with us. If you have any questions that come up after the session's finished, please get in touch. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Richard and John from Cambridge Econometrics, for presenting this interesting and insightful report. So now with this, we conclude the presentation section of the webinar, and we're running a bit tight of time, but we will still have at least one round of questions. So please, we'll just now take 30 seconds, and I would like to ask the audience if you could ask questions. We'll collect them and then just do one quick round. We already have questions from Marek and also from Mohammad and a couple more. Thank you. So please just write the questions now. Okay, and in the meantime, let me ask you, John and Richard, the question from Mohammad, who is asking, his question is that he would like to raise the question on the reduction of leakage from the EU economies resulting from oil imports. So he's asking, is it not an assumption that the EU would be able to procure all the needed raw materials within this region? This is because most of the needed materials are in Asia or South America, let's say lithium being one of them, a part of the assembly points and other raw materials. So this is for you, Cambridge Econometrics colleagues.
Yeah, thanks. So we've looked at we did some sensitivity analysis to look at battery manufacture and where battery manufacturing takes place to see how this impacts. Because you're right to say that certainly the impact the raw materials required for battery manufacture will be imported, and if actually also the production of the battery cells takes place outside Europe as it does currently, this is also another sort of leakage out of the European economy. But these leakages are much smaller than the current oil leakage that's taking place. The way to think about it is it's the cost of the battery at the point of purchase of the vehicle. So we're probably talking about a few thousand euro, maybe 5,000, 6,000 euros, as compared to the ongoing demand for oil once a vehicle is in use. And total expenditure on fuel in the conventional ICE is much more than that over the lifetime of the vehicle. So even if we assume that these batteries are manufactured outside of Europe, actually the leakage is much smaller than the reduction in oil expenditure.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we turn to the question from Claudia Cruz. So she would like to know if any of the speakers is currently working with any cities or companies to help build new green transport systems. So I guess she means more case studies, as in very tangible work in any of these cities or companies. So please, any one of the speakers who feel free to intervene.
We at Cambridge Econometrics are not. I don't think we have any projects for particular cities. Our work tends to be national or possibly regional level.
From the point of view of UNEC, of course, the UN being what it is, we don't have money to spend to physically buy infrastructure or rolling stock or buses of that nature. But we are working through the PEP initiative that I mentioned with a number of cities and a number of regional authorities to develop, let's say, guidelines or sustainable transport initiatives that benefit the region as a whole. So to name a couple, we're currently developing a cycling master plan to help the promotion of cycling in cities across Europe. Another of the key partnerships in the PEP is in relation to eco driving. So I think it's the Austrian government. We're working with them to develop steps to improve and to train people to drive in a more eco-friendly manner. We've also done some work on public transport promotion. So rather than specific cities, it's general policies, it's general work aimed at helping cities across the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have one more question for Alejandra. Alejandra, do you think there is any specific sector within transport where you think that the employment challenges driven by technological innovation in the sector will be more intensively felt?
Thanks, Adria. Well, yes, I think that mostly road transport will be the more impacted. For one, because of automation. So although autonomous vehicles are already here, I think it's important to emphasize that, there might still have a good half working career before full deployment takes place in certain countries. But this will further exacerbate a digital divide amongst countries. So it will need from high-income countries where automation is deployed, heavy reskilling and redirecting workers to other jobs. And I would also like to make a note on increased digitalization as smart cities and RFID and big data are heavily also implemented in the sector and this information might be held mostly in the hands of the private sector. From a labor perspective, I think there might be concerns of privacy or discrimination of workers, no, if appropriate redress mechanisms are not put in place. And aside, I would like to highlight it's also important to deploy effective public-private partnerships for data sharing, no, to make better use of resources in transport planning and providing decent work opportunities in the sector.
Okay, thank you very much for these interesting comments. Now, I'm sorry we cannot go over all the questions. So just to finalize with the session, I would like to ask our speakers to just give a brief wrap up and concluding remarks. So maybe we can start for our Cambridge Econometrics colleagues.
So let me just quickly respond to a question Marek asked. So about why there are more service jobs, even though e-cars require less maintenance. That is true. The service jobs are in other parts of the economy. So our summary is basically that it's the structural change that is big in all this, and there are definitely winners and losers both globally and also within countries, and that's the challenge.
Okay, thank you. Any concluding remarks from you, Francesco?
Sorry, just trying to unblock the speaker. I think just very quickly, what I would say that, you know, achieving sustainable transport is a long-term issue. It's not something that will happen overnight. The move to electric vehicles, to autonomous vehicles, it's something that will take a long time to filter through, both in developed and less developed countries. But again, there are many aspects of sustainable transport, as I've tried to highlight in my presentation. And while some are further ahead than others in the development, there is still a lot of work to do. And I think it really needs the involvement of all sectors around the world, but also around industry, to ensure that this can be done in an efficient manner and to the benefit of the population as a whole.
Thank you very much. So now we turn to Alejandra. Do you have any concluding remarks on the topic?
Just to really put focus and attention on tailored approaches between different countries and the divides that might be between them in the stages of greening, no? And how I think also there can be very positive linkages to other SDGs like road safety, no? That can provide synergies also for the regulation of road safety and the implementation of green policies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So with this, we finalize the session today. So let me just mention our big thank you to Alejandra, Francesco, Richard, and John for presenting and sharing their expertise with us today. And also to Fatma, who is our technical expert and has also been very helpful. Now we will follow up with you. So these questions that, for instance, we have from Evans, we will ask it to the speakers, and then we will follow up with an email with the answer, as well as we will send you the recorded version of the webinar, which you will be able to access anyway on our website. So this being said, on behalf of the GAIN Network, the Green Jobs Program, and also the speakers, thank you very much for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.